Now we've built a yard and the track plan for this layout is nearly complete. But now it's time to run some trains. We operate a small yard and make deliveries in this latest video in the From Loop to Layout series, coming up on JC's Rip Track. Hi there, my name is John and welcome to JC's Rip Track, a place for advice and tips on adding realism to your model trains or modeling anything for that matter. If you're looking for ways to transform your plastic models into something that looks like it belongs on the rails today, then click on subscribe and that little bell icon to receive a notification every time there's a new video. So start with a couple questions. How many of you have a yard on your layout? Is it a centerpiece? Do you use it for staging? Have you ever had one on a small layout? How do you operate it? Let me know in the comments section below. With the yard now built, the layout track plan is nearly complete, and I can now develop a functional operational plan that integrates this new yard with the whole layout, and we get to run some trains on it. Since it is a loop, it is possible to simply set up a train and let it go just to watch the trains go by. But creating an operational plan and running trains around that plan is a way to add more interest. When combined with the industries on the small layout, the yard helps simulate rail traffic moving in and out of the area. I'm doing an introduction to developing and operating a scheme and carrying it out. Toward the end of the video, I'll briefly cover a few additional ways to add some more variety once I show how operating something like this works. Even though this small layout is a loop, real railroads rarely are built or operate this way. Real-life exceptions might be a single industry, a port, or most commonly today, a historical park. So with that in mind, repeat after me. This loop is not a loop. Or rather, we don't operate a loop of track as if it is a loop. Instead, we employ a little bit of imagination to straighten it all out. In one of my previous videos, I described this track plan as effectively a double-sided switching layout, and that's precisely how we will operate it, and it might help if we straighten out the loop. So here's how we do that. Starting with the current track plan. It is no surprise that the track plan is a loop with several spurs and a yard. However, there are 4 groups of tracks that can help us create the operational illusion of a larger layout. From my Getting Started video, you may remember how much things change by dividing the layout down the middle so that we never see the whole loop at once. By making the yard separate from the industry tracks on the other side, we've already created some distance between these two parts of the layout. Now I'm going to go a little bit further. On the industry side of the layout, notice that the 3 spurs are pointed in one direction while the other 3 go the other way. One represents a single larger industry, while the other represents a port and a smaller industry. It's also a way to divide this side of the layout into 2 distinct sections that are not necessarily beside each other. Imagine for a moment that we use this as the dividing point, separating these 2 sets of spur tracks into 2 separate destination areas. We can create a track map or a schematic that effectively unfolds the loop, placing these 2 industry areas at opposite ends of the railroad with the yard in the middle. Even though the layout is still a loop in a purely practical sense, it is now a small division yard that receives traffic from an interchange. The delivered cargo is then distributed to and collected from destinations at either end of a short line. From a scenery perspective, creating some sort of visual divide on the industry side of the layout, such as a road, a hill, river, or buildings, can help make this look like different destinations. It's not necessary, but it can be a way to create several different scenes. Hopefully you've noticed that several of the physical tracks are pulling double duty when I created this track schematic, particularly the passing sidings. It is necessary for a layout of this size, but it also helps us to think about these different areas as different places on a larger layout. And you'll see how that works in just a moment. Now that we have a track schematic, it's helpful to assign some place names rather than just some generic yard and industries. So just for fun, let's call the yard area Middle Creek, with either end of the track schematic being Upper Middle Creek on the right and Lower Middle Creek on the left. If you're from or know the Canadian Maritimes, this might sound a little bit familiar. Naming destinations on your layout, even if they are temporary, make operations much more manageable. Beyond these 3 names, the interchange brings traffic on and off the layout from the broader world from any number of industries. When setting up for operations, we are coming in the middle of an unfolding story. It isn't a brand new railway accepting cars for the first time, but rather a short line that has seen action over the years. Even this sample operating session assumes that we are coming into an operational scheme that is already in progress. I can start working the cycle at any point, but for this demonstration, the action begins with the train coming on from the interchange track to drop off its cars and then picks up a line or a cut of cars to be taken back up the line. I set up an operating session using a simplified form of a system called Waybill and car cards to direct what goes where. This operating session happened across a few nights rather than all at once. It allowed for breaks, but it also kept my son interested in each part of the session. The Waybills and car cards allowed me to keep track of where things were and what I had to do next. I had recently used my 3D printer to create card slots for each stub-ended track represented on the layout. I took a little bit of time to prepare the cards and the simplified waybills, but it made things run much smoother in this session. Everything had a place to go. So here's how it all unfolded. I served as the conductor, and my son controlling the train as the engineer. We set about the various jobs one by one. This system works well, especially working with younger kids, and there isn't a need for multiple operators. The operation begins with an incoming train coming onto the layout from the interchange staging track bound for Middle Creek Yard. It completes 3 laps around the layout and then enters the arrival track to drop off all of its cars. Once this is completed, the incoming train then picks up an already prepared cut of cars to become an outbound train and moves off the layout. Except for the switcher, all of the trains moving on the layout take 2 or more laps around the loop. It allows the trains to move onto the right tracks and simulates the trains as traversing longer distances before arriving at each destination. Next, once the outgoing train goes onto the interchange track, we switch control to the yard switcher and bring it out of its parking track for service. The switcher sorts and assembles the newly arrived cars into 2 smaller outgoing local trains and switches one of the covered hoppers into its destination on the team track. The switcher builds the first outbound local train with 4 cars destined for Middle Creek onto track 1, while the second one, bound for Upper Middle Creek, comes together on track 2 with 5 cars, including a covered hopper that had been sitting in the team track. With its task completed, the switcher returns to its service track in the yard. 2 more locomotives in a group called a consist then move out of their parking track where they will then serve as the power for the next 2 trains. The pair connects to train 1, preparing to head to Lower Middle Creek, where it will not only drop off its 4 cars, but bring 5 back. Pulling out of the yard, the locomotives need to take a runaround move so that train 1 is headed in the right direction. Once the locomotives connect to the other end of the train, they pull away and do 3 laps around the layout, also representing the distance traveled to Lower Middle Creek. The train arrives at the passing siding short of Lower Middle Creek, and the locomotives make a runaround move to switch the industries. The waybills tell me which cars need to go where. The pickup was simple. 3 white tank cars on track 1 and 2 yellow box cars on track 3. However, the incoming train also needed to drop off a tank car on track 1, a covered hopper on track 2, and 2 scrap gondolas on track 3. Through a series of switching moves, my son and I transferred the cars to where they needed to be. We did these moves with the incoming and outgoing rolling stock together, rearranging as we went so that the incoming cars and the outgoing cars ended up exactly where they needed to be. Once done, it was time to return to Middle Creek Yard with the 5 outgoing cars. And again, doing 3 laps around the layout to simulate the distance, the locomotive dropped off its new cars in the first yard track. With the Train 1 job completed and after a break, the locomotives then moved to pick up Train 2 for delivery to Upper Middle Creek. As with the other trains, a few laps around the layout simulates the distance between Middle Creek Yard and the industry at Upper Middle Creek. Upon arriving, the locomotives make a runaround move and set to switch the industry, drop off 5 cars, and pick up 5 according to the instructions on the waybills. While these tracks are configured for the Inglenook switching puzzle, which I talked about in an earlier video, we operated them as a 3-track industry. With 5 cars in, 5 cars out, and 3 cars staying in the industry, we had our work cut out for us. Like the Lower Middle Creek job, we did the Upper Middle Creek task with the incoming train attached, switching cars back and forth until everything was where it needed to be. It made for some complicated switching moves, but that is a significant part of the fun. And now with everything delivered or picked up, Train 2 made its way back to Middle Creek Yard. After 3 laps around the layout, the train arrived at the yard, dropping this new cut of cars off on track 2. And the consist returned to its track with both jobs now complete and the crew couldn't rest. The switcher then moves out of its track to sort the return cars into the next 2 outgoing trains. The next train would include 4 of the cars exchanged from the just completed local jobs, as well as 4 cars that were already waiting in the yard. Additionally, the switcher sorts 6 cars picked up on the local runs into track 3, where they will wait a subsequent outgoing train. It simulates traffic coming on and off the layout, departing for different destinations rather than a single inbound-outbound train. In all, this operating session happened over a series of evenings, occupying about 2.5 hours worth of moving trains. Again, I take this as a parenting victory with a 6-year-old engineer. As I mentioned earlier, I used a stripped-down version of the Waybill system from Micro-Mark tools, keeping the information on the supplied waybills very simple given that this layout is still in development. I have card boxes that I created on my 3D filament printer, and the system worked very nicely for what I was doing here. It was a helpful way for me to keep track of what needed to go where and when things were properly delivered. There are alternate means of handling this, including switch lists or even a random dice roll, and it is worth a sidebar video completely on its own. So while this series isn't quite my usual weathering fare, I thought this could help anyone getting started in the hobby. Plus, it has me building and operating my layout with my son, especially after my big move. If this is something that you find helpful, then please click on subscribe and the little bell icon that appears if you want to be notified anytime I put out a new video. If you click on show more in the area below this video, you can check out some helpful links on social media, my Patreon page, my Thingiverse page, and my Amazon page that features some of the track that you see here if you can't find it at your local hobby shop. So thanks for watching, good luck, and may you keep on track.